Hello, Man in Gray here with another Man in Gray book review. Now, normally I say today's book is, but it's not a book today. It's a whole bunch of small books. This is the Penguin Little Black Classics box set. It's 80 volumes, 5,120 pages, and it was published in 2015 by Penguin Random House. And yes, I have read all of these, one a day for 80 straight days. Okay, so why does this set exist? This is a box set that was published by Penguin in 2015 to mark the 80th anniversary of Penguin Books. Penguin Books was founded in 1935 by Alan, John, and Richard Allen, who were, they came up with this idea of a brilliant idea of publishing little paperback editions of classic books for college students and autodidacts who just want to read Homer or Dickens or whatever. And that doesn't sound like such a radical idea today, but before 1935, before Penguin Books came out, if you wanted to read Dickens or Homer or Sophocles, the only way to do that was in a hardbound edition, and those were expensive. So if you were a college student, you either had to go to the library and hope that you could find the book and check it out and then read it as fast as you could before you had to turn it back in, or you had to go shell out money for an expensive hardback book. So this idea of publishing cheap paperback editions of classic books had a huge market. It was successful from the very beginning. Of course, Penguin Books is still around now. They're, I think they'll be 90 years old next year. So that'll be a big event also. So this was a huge deal, and it also kind of rehabilitated the attitude people had about paperback books. Prior to Penguin's coming out with these kind of books, paperbacks were considered trashy. It was pulp fiction, dime novels, crime stories, girly books, things like that. And so when Penguin decided to come out with classic books in this paperback format, it really helped kind of make it acceptable to other publishers. And then, of course, other publishers copied Penguin, putting out paperback editions of classic books as well. But Penguin has been the most successful. So what do you get here? Well, what you get is there are 80 volumes. Each one of these is really, it's kind of a booklet. They're about 65 pages each. And the idea being that you could read one of these in an hour. Because most people, if you're a decent reader, you can read 65 pages in an hour. And so the idea is you could read this on your lunch break, or if you're commuting by train or something, you could read one of these. And it gives you a sample of some of the classic authors that are available in the Penguin line. All of these are excerpts from longer Penguin books. And so they serve as samplers. So if you don't know, if you want to read Tolstoy or Sophocles or whatever, you can read this little excerpt from their work and decide whether you want to read them or not. So it's a real clever idea. Well, this box set turned out to be so popular that they issued another 20 or so volumes outside of this box set. So there's really like 100 altogether. And you can buy each one of these volumes separately. You don't have to buy the whole box set if you don't want to. If there's 4 or 5 of these that sound interesting to you, you can buy those separately. I checked a few weeks ago on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and they cost about, in the U.S. dollars, they're usually around $5 to $7 a piece. So they're not too expensive. And they are, little paperback books. They're not very durable. You can read them maybe once or twice, and then they're probably going to fall apart. So the whole idea is really just to kind of introduce them, the writers, to you. So what I'm going to do now for the rest of the video is I'm going to go through all 80 of these real quickly. All I'm going to do is tell you the title, the author, and what kind of book it is, so you can kind of get an idea of this. I forgot to mention this also. This was so popular that a few years later they issued a second box set of books from the 20th century called Penguin Little Modern Classics. These are all books that date from about 1925 back to ancient India. So these are all books that are in the public domain. And, if you don't want to shell out money for any of these, you can read all of these books, basically, are available for free on Project Gutenberg. They have, ebook editions of that. But it's still kind of nice to have hard, hard copy, a paper-bound version of these books. Some people prefer, real physical books to ebooks, but all these are available for free. If you dig around, you can find a free e-copy because these are all in the public domain. The little modern classic series, those are all still copyrighted, and those are all books that Penguin and Random House hold the copyright to. So I may review that set later on. So just to show you the back here, it says, it's got a little quotation, all nations, colors, barbarism, civilizations, and languages. And so that's really basically what they're doing here. Okay, so I'll pull a few of these out at a time. And one thing about this set is the books are so small and they're jammed in here so tightly that it's really, really hard to get them out of here. That's one of the problems I have with this. It's just physically getting them out of the set is kind of tricky. Once you get the first few volumes out, though, it's pretty easy. There we go. Let's get some of these out here. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is go through the titles of these real quick and kind of tell you what they're about. Okay. Let's see. The first one is by Giovanni Boccaccio, and it's called Mrs. Rosie and the Priest. These are a handful of stories from the Decameron, his famous collection of 100 stories from the Middle Ages. Number two is Gerald Manley Hopkins' poetry volume, As Kingfishers Catch Fire. This is a collection of kind of experimental poetry from the first decade of the 20th century, British poet. Then we have, the volume number three is the Saga of Gunlong Serpentung. This is one of the Icelandic sagas from the Middle Ages. So I think it's actually got more than one in here. Let's see real quickly. No, it's just the one. Okay, it's an Icelandic saga. Then we have Thomas de Quincey, English writer from the early 1700s, on murder, considered as one of the fine arts. This is a classic little essay about a serial killer who predates Jack the Ripper. There was a serial killer on the loose in London in the 1700s, and this is a book about that and the idea of murder as it is. Then we have Friedrich Nietzsche, Aphorisms on Love and Hate, a collection of his aphorisms of the German philosopher. Next we have John Ruskin, Traffic. This is a Victorian art critic, and this is a couple of his lectures on art from the Victorian era. Then we have Pu Song Ling, Chinese short stories, I believe. Yes, a collection of Chinese ghost stories from, let's see what period this is from. From the 1600s, 1600s AD. Okay, then we have Jonathan Swift's famous A Modest Proposal and a couple of other stories. Of course, his famous satire about cannibalism, the Irish potato famine and so forth. So if you like Swift, that would be good. Then we have three Tang Dynasty poets. Let's see. These are, the three poets here are Wang Wei, Li Po, and Tu Fu. These are short little nature poems, mostly from China. Okay, then we have Walt Whitman, On the Beach at Night. These are some poems from Leaves of Grass. Then we have Kenko, A Cup of Sake Beneath the Cherry Trees. These are little stories, I believe. I can't remember all of these. These are little short stories from the 1300s. Okay, in Japan. Then we have Baltasar Gracian, How to Use Your Enemies. This was a Spanish writer from the 1700s, and he's kind of like the Spanish version of Okay, sorry about that. There was a lawnmower going around by my neighborhood. This always happens every time I try to do one of these videos. An airplane goes over, or somebody rings the doorbell, the clock goes off or something. So I'm sorry. Anyway, I was saying this is Baltasar Gracian. He was a Spanish writer, lived in the 1700s, similar to Machiavelli. This is very similar to The Prince, kind of advice for rulers. Then we have John Keats, The Eve of St. Angus, is some of his poetry from the famous British poet. Then we have Thomas Hardy, Women Much Missed. This is another collection of poetry from the novelist, Victorian novelist and poet, Thomas Hardy. Then we have Femme Fatale by Guy de Maupassant, the famous French short story writer, a collection of his famous short stories. Then we have Marco Polo Travels in the Land of Serpents and Pearls. This is an excerpt from Marco Polo's famous travel book about his travels in China. Then we have Suetonius Caligula. This is an excerpt from his from the Roman writer Suetonius from his book, The Lives of the Caesars, the 12 Caesars. And this is the chapter on Caligula and all the terrible things. Most of what we know about the early emperors comes from Suetonius, but there's really doubts about how accurate he was. Some of these stories he may have exaggerated. Anyway, then we have Apollonius of Rhodes. It's another Roman classic, Jason and Medea. It's an excerpt from Jason and the Argonauts, the famous Roman story there. Then we have Robert Louis Stevenson. Olalla. This is a collection of his short stories, kind of Gothic stories. Then we have Karl Marx and Frederick Engels' The Communist Manifesto, a famous little booklet about communism and why communism is such a great thing. It's going to free the people and so forth. There's still people that follow Marxism. Petronius. Trimolachio's Feast. This is a Roman writer. This is a chapter from the Satyricon, a satirical novel. Then we have Johann Peter Hebel, How a Ghastly Story Was Brought to Light by a Commoner Garden Butcher's Dog. Let me read that again. How a Ghastly Story Was Brought to Light by a Commoner Garden Butcher's Dog. This is a collection of short stories by a Swiss writer from, let's see what his dates are here. Late 1700s. Okay. Then we have Hans Christian Andersen, The Tinderbox, a collection of his fairy tales, right? Then we have Rudyard Kipling, The Gate of 100 Sorrows. This is a collection of his short stories. Kipling, a great short story writer, mainly known now for the Jungle Book and the Just So stories and some of his novels, but he was, I think, a really, truly great short story writer. Dante, Circles of Hell. This is a few excerpts from the Inferno section of the Divine Comedy. Then we have Henry Mayhew of Street Piemen. This was a Victorian-era journalist, and these are some little short newspaper columns about Victorian England, so just kind of put in there for color. Then we have Hafiz, the Persian poet. Nightingales Are Drunk, some famous Arab poetry. Then we have Chaucer, The Wife of Bath. This is a story from Canterbury Tales, of course. Then we have Montaigne, Miguel de Montaigne, How We Weep and Laugh at the Same Time. These are some excerpts from his famous collection of essays, the father of the essay. Then we have Thomas Nash, The Terrors of the Night. This is another Victorian ghost story writer. Then we have Edgar Allan Poe, Telltale Heart. This is, of course, famous Poe story. There's 2 or 3 other stories in here as well, Poe horror stories. Mary Kingslow, Hippo Banquet, Mary Kingsley. She was a Victorian-era travel writer, one of the first female travel writers in England. She traveled. This is a collection of her accounts of stuff she experienced traveling in Africa during the Victorian era. Then we have Jane Austen, The Beautiful Cassandra. These are a collection of her little stories she wrote as a teenager. Some of her juvenile. So if you've read Jane Austen's novels and you're looking for some other Austen to read, that would come in handy. Anton Chekhov, Gooseberries, the famous Russian short story writer. It's a collection of his famous stories. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Well, They Are Gone, and Here I Must Remain. Poetry from Coleridge, guy that wrote the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Then we have Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the great German writer. Sketchy, doubtful, incomplete jottings. These are basically journal entries. I'm going to put this over here. Journal entries from Goethe. Then we have Charles Dickens, The Great Wingberry Duel. These are some chapters from his first book, Sketches by Boz, which were little stories about their journalism, basically, little short stories about stuff happening in Victorian England. So it's not a novel, or it's not a short story. It's nonfiction by Dickens. Dickens wrote quite a bit of nonfiction, actually. Then we have Herman Melville, The Maldives Shark. This is a collection of short stories that Melville wrote. A lot of people don't read Melville's stories, but he was a good short story writer also. Then we have Elizabeth Gaskell, The Old Nurse's Story, some more Gothic short stories, Gothic fiction. Then we have Nikolai Leskov. This is a 19th century Russian writer, and this is a novella by him. Then we have Henri de Balzac, the great French short story writer and novelist, The Atheist's Mass. This is a collection of short stories. Then we have Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper. This is their famous story about spousal abuse, but it also contains some other short stories as well. Then we have C.P. Caffrey. This is called Remember Body. And this is, a collection of poetry from late 1800s. Then we have Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian writer, The Meek Ones, collection of his short stories. And then we have Gustave Flaubert, Simple Heart, another collection of short stories by the great French writer Nicolas Gogol. This is The Nose. It's one of his novellas, one of the fathers of Russian literature, a classic satirical book. Samuel Pepys, The Great Fire of London. Pepys, the diarist from the 1600s. And early 1700s. This is the diary entries that concern the famous Fire of London. Edith Wharton, another late Victorian, early 20th century novelist, The Reckonings, collection of her stories. Then we have Henry James, the American who moved to London. The Figure in the Carpet, another collection of his short stories. Then we have Wilfred Owen, Anthem for a Doomed Youth. He was a World War I poet who was killed during World War I. It's probably the greatest of the World War I British war poets. Then we have something a little different. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, My Dearest Father. These are letters that Mozart wrote to his father, and some of the letters that his father wrote back to him. And it reveals a lot about Mozart's personality. A lot of what we know about Mozart comes from those letters, which fortunately his family preserved. Then we have Plato, Socrates' Defense. This is the account of Socrates' trial and death as reported by Plato in some of his dialogues. Then we have Christina Rossetti, the Victorian poet, Goblin Market. This is her long poem, kind of a weird poem. It's very strange, along with some of her other poems, most of which are religious in nature. Then we have Sinbad the Sailor. This is a collection of stories from the 1001 Nights, Arabic classic tales. Then we have Sophocles' Antigone, the great Greek playwright. I think this is the only play in this whole set. The second of the Theban plays, right? Oedipus Rex and Oedipus at Colonus and Antigone. It's the second of those. And then, gosh, I always mispronounce this guy's name. Ranosuke Akutagawa, Japanese writer. He's the guy who wrote, short story writer. He's the guy that wrote Rashomon. And this is called The Life of a Stupid Man. It's a handful of his great short stories from the Japanese writer, whose name I can't pronounce. Sorry about that. Leo Tolstoy, How Much Land Does a Man Need? These are some short stories by the great Russian writer. Then we have Giorgio Vasari, Leonardo da Vinci. Vasari was a art historian who lived in the 1500s, at the same time as Michelangelo and all these people. And he wrote a long book of biographies of all these artists of the day. And we're very, very fortunate he did that, because a lot of these artists, the only thing we know about them is what he tells us in these stories. Of course, we know about Da Vinci from other sources too, but this is a contemporary biography, basically, of Da Vinci. So it's a first-person account. This guy actually knew Da Vinci, and he knew Michelangelo, and he knew all those other famous Italian painters. So very lucky that we have this, and this is one of the chapters from that book. Then we have Oscar Wilde, the Irish writer, Lord Arthur Saville's Crime. This is a collection of his stories. Then we have Shin Fu, The Old Man in the Moon, some more Japanese short stories from the early 19th century. Then we have Aesop, the Greek fable writer, The Dolphins, the Whales, and the Gudgeon. It's a collection of his some of his fables. Then we have Matsu Basho, the Japanese writer famous for his haiku. I think there's some other poems besides haiku in here. Lips Too Chilled, mostly haiku, nature poetry, Japanese poetry. Emily Bronte. A lot of people don't realize she was also a poet. This contains some of Bronte's poems rather than her novel. Okay. Then we have Joseph Conrad, the Czech writer who wrote in English. Tomorrow, this is a collection of his short stories. Then we have Richard Hakluyt, The Voyage of Sir Francis Drake Around the Globe. Hakluyt was a British writer in the 1600s who wrote an account of various English voyages. He was trying to promote the idea of English sea power